Hello everyone. Wow, strap yourselves in. We got a long commentary ahead of us. I've made the best tier 10 cruiser and the best tier 10 DD, and people have been asking for best tier 10 battleship commentary for as long as I can remember. And I've been kind of putting it off, partly because I wanted to see what kind of balancing changes they would make to the Conqueror, but they seem to have finalized the changes on that ship. I also wanted to see how they finalized the Republic, and in general, well, I've probably also been lazy, let's be honest, because this is a pretty big undertaking. Now, before we begin this commentary, there are two very important mechanics that we have to go over, because I will be referencing these a lot, and they are very important to understand when it comes to understanding how battleships and cruisers in general work. The first mechanic we have is overmatch. I'm not going to go too much into detail on it. Overmatch means when the caliber of your guns, your shells, is large enough in this game, you can ignore armor. That's the very simple explanation. When your shells are large enough, to a certain extent, you can ignore a certain threshold of armor. And this depends on your caliber, on your gun size. In the case of, for example, the Montana with its 406mm guns, which is the smallest among tier 10 battleships, but still very significant, we can easily calculate the overmatch on the ship by dividing 406mm divided by 14.3, and we end up with something like 28.4. Now the important thing here is the closest important value that we can overmatch is 27mm, because that's what you're going to be seeing on many ships, on many cruisers. In fact, it is a very common value, especially when these cruisers try to go nose in against you or they try to angle. Having that 27mm overmatch is significant. So that is one mechanic you have to understand. Overmatching. It doesn't, if I have 406mm guns and a Des Moines tries to go full nose in against me like this, he tries to angle like this to prevent being citadeled, I can put my crosshair right on his citadel, right through his nose, because my big shells will completely ignore his armor thanks to this calculation. I will overmatch his armor, I will bypass it, and I will get straight into that juicy citadel hiding behind it without any effect to the shells at all. So that is the overmatch mechanic, and that is something I will be quoting a lot because it's very, very important in clearing out the differences between these ships. Another thing that you need to understand is how does HE penetration work? Now, the very simple explanation on HE penetration is you take your gun caliber, once again, you divide it by 6, and that is your HE pen. So the most common value that you will face, the most common HE pen that you will face is, for example, 203mm guns, because a lot of cruisers have them. You see them on Zao, you see them on Des Moines and so forth. You're going to see a lot of these. There are some small variations, and I will get into those in just a bit, but you divide this 203mm by 6 and you end up with 33.8-ish penetration. Now the closest relevant threshold here is 32mm, and that is the armor that you can pen. And this is, of course, a very significant armor, because 32mm armor in return is what we see on a lot of these battleships. This is a very common armor value on a lot of battleships, and of course being able to penetrate this is very significant. So obviously this also means that if you have armor that's greater than 32mm, it's a huge advantage, because you're mostly going to be facing this 32mm pen, so any larger than that and you have a very high chance of completely shattering the shells and not taking any damage. There are, of course, some exceptions. Now Moskva has 220mm guns, but if we calculate divided by 6, we end up with about 37mm pen, and that's completely irrelevant because there's no real 37mm armor, so it fits into the same bracket with 32mm pen. Worcester and light cruisers, pretty much all of them will, any good players will spec IFHE, so the default pen will get boosted also to 32mm. So 32mm pen is pretty much the average across the board that you will be dealing with at tier 10. There are small exceptions. Henry, with 240mm guns, can actually pen, when you divide it by 6, you end up with 40mm, and it's significant on ships like, for example, the Montana that has a 38mm deck armor, so the Henry can in fact pen this. And then of course we have the Hindenburg, which is pretty much an exception to the rule, because even though it has 203mm guns, its penetration actually gets divided by 4 instead of by 6. So you end up being able to pen 50mm, which of course means that it's exceptionally strong against pretty much all battleships, because all these 50mm armor belts that can usually shatter the rest of the HE is going to be penned by this Hindenburg pen. So the reason why I went through this is because I want you to understand why I call certain calibers an advantage, and why I call certain armor values an advantage. Because this is very important when you compare the different tier 10 battleships. This was a very compressed and simple version of all of this. There are some differences, like I'll get into them later and in more detail, but I needed you guys to have a basic understanding of this, because otherwise many of the comparisons and many of the explanations that I will give will probably go right by. Anyway, let's move on to the first ship in this commentary. Now, the very first ship that I'll be featuring in this comparison is probably one of the most legendary ones as well, and that is the Japanese tier 10 battleship, the Yamato. Now, the first thing that probably comes to mind to many people when you mention the Yamato is, of course, the guns. The ship has the largest caliber guns in the entire game, and back in the day Wargaming did say that they were never going to make any ship that has larger caliber guns than this. And in fact, when they added the Conqueror, for example, they purposely limited the guns to 457mm, 3mm less than the Yamato. So they have been keeping their word. So as of now, and probably in the future as well, this ship is going to have the biggest guns in the game. The AP, of course, is absolutely terrifying. You have the longest range in the game, and even though the shell velocity of 780 meters per second on the AP doesn't sound that impressive, the fact that the shells are so massive, so large, they have so much mass, means that the actual air drag is quite small, and you can consistently punish ships pretty much anywhere on the map. Broadsides get heavily punished, and even if ships try to angle against you, well, if we quote that overmatch mechanic that I mentioned earlier, here we for example have a prime example. I punish the Alabama giving me broadside, the Alabama starts turning in, starts nosing in towards me, and I have absolutely no issues putting my crosshair right on his nose and overmatching his nose armor instead. So this strength, this unique ability to straight up overmatch enemy battleships as well, is what gives the Yamato its incredible strength. There is no target that can be pretty much immune to you. Even the Kurfürst, that actually has more armor on the nose, even he will struggle against the sheer firepower that this ship can pump out. So when it comes to pure firepower, pure devastating scary firepower, there is no battleship that does it better than the Yamato. That doesn't mean that these guns come without their issues, of course, though. The turret traverse is by far the worst. It is by far the worst at tier 10 without any competition. They are buffing it slightly, but even with the buff, it's still going to be the worst turret traverse across the board. Another issue with the ship is that the fuse arming threshold, meaning how much armor you have to penetrate in order for the shells to arm, is the highest across the board as well, at 76mm. Anything less than that and the shells won't arm, and you will probably end up getting an overpen. So there are some definitive downsides to these guns. They are slow, they're clumsy, but usually the sheer firepower you have at hand makes up for it. There are other problems though with the ship. Now, at first glance, it looks very, very tanky. The ship sits at a pretty damn impressive 97.2k health. It's not quite as impressive as the Kurfürst 106, but then again, it does beat the rest of the competition. It also has some of the best torpedo bulge pretty much in the game. It has a 55% torpedo reduction, and it actually has, this is a bit of a hidden stat, but it has minus 85% flooding resistance. In comparison, the Kurfürst has minus 75, so having minus 85 is pretty significant. Conqueror has minus 76 and Montana has minus 79 and so forth, but it is significant, so you are very resistant to these things. I did mention the armor as well, I did mention the armor thresholds, and of course the front deck is 50 millimeters, and the middle deck is 57 millimeters. So that means even the Hindenburg with its ridiculous 50 millimeters HE pen will not be able to deal raw damage. It will deal to the superstructure, of course, but not to the center part. So looks very tanky, looks very efficient, but this is where the problems start to crop up when it comes to the ship. No ship only has strengths in this game. Well, almost no ship. But the Yamato is no exception to this rule. The Yamato is actually the slowest battleship at tier 10, 27 knots. Pretty much all the competition does 30 or 29.5, so 27 is a pretty clear, pretty much 10% downgrade when it comes to speed. The rudder shift time is also pretty much the worst. I mean, 22.1, I think Montana has 22.2, but it does have some different modules to help it there. The turning circle is pretty good at 900 meters, but here comes the problem with the turning circle and in general turning the ship. It has one of the most vulnerable citadels of all tier 10 BBs. In fact, I will just say it has the most vulnerable citadel of all tier 10s, because it is highly elevated from sea level, and it also has this weird shape, which means that you can get consistent citadels against the ship if it gives you just a bit too much broadside. In fact, you can give less broadside than in any other BB, and you can still get consistently citadeled through this frontal weakness, which I will demonstrate a fair few times during this commentary, because it is a very common spot for people to shoot, since people are quite well aware of it. Another thing worth mentioning is the AA. Well, the first question is probably what AA, and that's that's sadly a very good question, because the ship practically has no anti-air at all. It rates across the board the worst when it comes to anti-air defense. It just struggles. Sure, you can build for it, but ultimately it's usually not really worth the effort to try to build for this AA. All the values across the board will suffer. You will struggle to get anything good. Yes, if you go full, I mean, manual AA and stuff like that, but ultimately, if you really want to build an AA battleship, the Yamato should not be the first choice. Stick with the Republic or the Montana or even the Conqueror. Hell, well, even the Kurfürst. Anything is better than trying to build the Yamato into an anti-air ship. It simply doesn't work. So, major weaknesses. Major strengths of this ship is absolutely the sheer raw gunpowder. The penetration is not the highest, it's only at max range pretty much. I think higher than 18 km the pen is the highest. Other than that, the Republic actually has the best penetration. But the strengths is the accuracy and the overmatch mechanic, which allows it to deal damage to pretty much all targets. Anything you shoot at, you will most likely damage, and that is a scary foe to face. Also, a nose-in angled Yamato is very hard to deal with, unless you have a Yamato of your own to overmatch his 32mm armor. You're going to struggle to deal with him. But then again, if you got carriers or you got DDs that force him to move, force him to give that broadside where that vulnerable citadel is available, well, suddenly it's not as invincible as it seems at first glance. The second tier 10 battleship I will feature is the American tier 10 Montana. Now, unlike the Yamato, it doesn't have access to those massive overmatching 460mm guns. In fact, it only has 406mm guns, which are among the smallest at tier 10. However, it is able to slot a module that reduces dispersion by 11%, and it already has quite a good accuracy to begin with. So this combination gives it very consistent accuracy, especially in dealing with cruisers and DDs, and that raw firepower, that alpha strike potential of being able to lob 12 shells at your target is quite terrifying. In fact, it has the highest alpha strike of any tier 10 battleship at 162k potential alpha per volley. So not guns to be underestimated by any means, even if they lack the overmatch potential of the Yamato guns. The ship itself sits at 96.3k health, just shy of what the Yamato has. The torpedo belt isn't quite up to Yamato's insane standards. It only has a 37%, 39 if you slot the module that pretty much everyone uses, and the flood resistance is 79%. It is faster though, at 30 knots. On the other hand though, it does have the worst rudder shift at 22.2 seconds, but it also has a turning radius of 950, which is slightly worse than the Yamato's, but in essence it's actually less punishing than Yamato's turning because the Citadel isn't nearly as vulnerable as Yamato's Citadel. It has a slight concealment advantage over, I think, Yamato and Republic, and I think Grosse Kurfürst, but the differences are very small at this point. Montana with full stealth build reaches 13.4 km concealment, Yamato has 13.5, so very small difference and not something that will really have much of an impact. The AA on the ship is very strong though. That is something to keep in mind. The AA is extremely strong on the ship. It's not quite the strongest considering the Republic has been added, but tier 8 carriers especially will want to avoid you, and even higher tier carriers in general won't want to strike targets that are near you, simply because the additional AA power that you will provide can be quite significant. Especially, of course, because the second module, the third module on US battleships, you cannot slot the improved accuracy module. So the default module people choose is the AA range module instead. So this means by default already most US BBs, especially the Montana, will have quite a significant AA armament. That doesn't, of course, mean that you're suddenly immune to carriers. No, absolutely not. Any tier 9, tier 10 carrier that actually wants to strike you will not have any issues killing you unless you have some sort of support that can provide you with defensive AA. They might not kill you in the first strike, but they will eventually get you down, and that's the life of a battleship really. It's only at certain tiers and certain specific ships that can actually make themselves completely immune, and no tier 10 battleship can really pull that off. And of course, if you are forced to turn, I did mention the Montana has a significantly lower citadel. It's practically a waterline citadel. However, if you are forced to turn, be it because of torpedoes or because of carriers or whatever, or simply you're in a bad position, your citadel can be punished. Not as easily as Yamato's citadel, but especially at long ranges when you get that plunging fire, the Montana citadel is certainly strikeable. Getting a devastating on a Montana, well, that's quite rare, extremely rare in fact, but citadel hits should not be underestimated because battleships heal significantly less citadel damage than they heal normal damage. Armor-wise, it's pretty much 32mm all over, except the middle top deck, which is 38. And this is of course significant, as I mentioned in the beginning, why I mentioned all those armor values. It means that you can pretty much shatter all of the HE coming your way, with few exceptions like Hindenburg and Henry IV. But in general, you are quite resilient against HE spam in the Montana. You do have a fair amount of superstructure to be farmed though, so not immune, but somewhat more resilient than certain other ships that I will get to in a bit. The Montana though, it's served pretty much a role as the versatile, good against everything. It doesn't really excel against anything. You could say that, wow, it's really good against cruisers because it has so many guns and so forth, but all battleships are kind of good against cruisers. So you could also say it has really good AA, but it's still not really, no battleship is really that god tier against carriers. And if you really try to build your battleship as a full AA battleship, sure, it will work, you will have significantly stronger AA, but then it relies on, first of all, being matched up against the carrier and having that carrier actively hunt you, which is a lot of ifs and maybes. Ultimately though, the Montana has been a staple workhorse of pretty much World of Warships ever since the beginning. It's never been bad, it's never been considered god tier, although in competitive it has had a very strong presence, but that presence has been started to be offset as the meta has been changing. Never a weak ship though, and never a ship to be underestimated. The Grosse Kurfürst is the third battleship added to this comparison, and the Grosse Kurfürst is a bit different in the way that you can actually slot two different types of guns on it. You can slot 406mm guns or 420mm guns. Now going back to that overmatch explanation I made earlier on, 420mm guns doesn't actually offer you any real overmatch advantage. It allows you to overmatch 29mm instead of 28, but because the most common thresholds are 27 and 30, the actual impact is non-existent in the game. What you essentially do is you trade some reload, the lower caliber ones reload faster, you trade them for some slightly higher alpha, and slightly better penetration at long range. Accuracy is identical, and the DPM of the 406s is actually better. That's why I personally always recommend the 406mm guns, and that's why I use them, because one of the great strengths of these guns is the ability to reload in 29 seconds, or if you run the reload module, which I have recommended, then you have a 25.5 second reload. And when you have these guns, even though German accuracy is notoriously bad, the ability to lob out 12 of these shells with a very good shell velocity, the German shell velocity is 810, so even long-range shots are perfectly doable. So the ability to lob out these massive volleys of German AP every 25.5 seconds is very scary to deal with, and it is very frustrating to deal with as well. Now, health-wise, well, one more thing I should mention is that it's actually, the Grosse Kurfürst is very limited on range. For a tier 10 battleship, it only has 20.6 km range, which is by far the lowest of all tier 10 battleships. But then again, the ship was never designed or never intended as some sort of a long-range sniper. Yes, we might see a lot of people play it as one, but that's not what the ship was designed for. In fact, if we look at some important things here, we see the hit points. Almost 106,000 hit points. This is far more than any other battleship has. No one even breaks 100k except for the potatoes that slot survivability expert on their battleships. Other than that, the Kurfürst is by far the healthiest of them all. The torpedo protection is not very impressive at 27%, but then again, we have other tools to help us against torpedoes, namely Hydro, which I will get to in a bit. Armor-wise, or armor scheme-wise, it is also designed to be the tanky monster. If we take a look at the armor, we might see, you remember I mentioned 32mm being overmatched by Yamato? Well, the only parts that 32mm on this ship is these small parts, on the bow and on the stern. In reality though, if a Yamato tries to shoot your nose, he's going to be hitting this 60mm plating, and that's especially at these angles, that's going to be auto bouncing. I also mentioned HE, the most common threshold being 32mm. Well, Kurfürst, 50mm, 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 and just a very, very small part at the aft end that is actually able to be penned. So when it comes to HE resistance, no other battleship comes close to the Grosse Kurfürst. Only the Hindenburg and other battleships shooting HE are really considerable HE threats. The rest of the HE just shatters. Of course, the superstructure can still be farmed, but especially later in the game, when the Grosse Kurfürst superstructure has been saturated, there is very few parts of the ship that can actually be effectively farmed by HE. And thanks to the great HP pool, you should quite easily be able to survive until that superstructure has been saturated. Another thing that of course allows it to close this distance, another important thing, is the fact that it has turtle back armor. What this essentially means that it has two layers of armor which are angled. So any AP coming in will more than likely bounce against one of these angled internal armor parts, and even though and pretty much render it impossible to land any citadels on the ship. Grosse Kurfürst gets citadeled extremely rarely. If it gets citadeled, it's a very long-range plunging fire, or it's one of those freak shots that go through, basically they pen through the nose part of the ship, and they've managed to bypass the turtleback to reach the citadel. Both of these in actual combat, exceedingly rare. More than often though, if a Grosse Kurfürst dies, it's not because of citadel damage it has taken. This does come with the downside though. Having this amazing armor all over the side and all over the ship isn't always such a great thing. Because this is a big ship with really bad firing arcs, it means you have to expose a lot of broadsides to use all your guns. And especially Montana and such, getting to shoot this juicy armor on the broadside will always arm their AP shells, because this belt is more than enough to arm the AP, which means it's not uncommon to do 20 to 30k AP volleys on a broadside Kurfürst. So the advantages it gains in being immune to citadels is something it trades off by being very prone to eating full penetrations, unlike many other battleships who, when they give broadside, tend to eat over penetrations. That doesn't happen much with the Grosse Kurfürst, and that is a significant downside. Another downside of the ship is the sheer size. It's absolutely massive. I would say it's a quarter bigger than any other tier 10 battleship pretty much in the game. And being huge is not a good thing in World of Warships. This affects the concealment, and more importantly, it also affects the turning circle. 1,050-meter turning circle, by far the worst of all tier 10 battleships. None of the others even break 1,000 meters. This one has 1,050. So clumsy, huge, massive, but very tanky. The idea is, of course, to get close enough to be able to put those guns to use, but because of the way the games play out, that's not always that easy. Now, it does have some unique tools that no other battleship really has at tier 10, and that is, of course, having access to hydroacoustic surge. This is especially important because this is the German hydroacoustic surge, which is notoriously stronger than all other hydros in the game, which means that even though it's vulnerable to torpedoes because of the massive size and slow turning circle, it also has unique tools to deal with enemy DDs and in general to dodge these incoming torps as well. Once again, this is all part of the kit that is designed to make the ship a brawling battleship. Immunity to citadels, very tanky armor in all situations, hydro to deal with this, short range guns but extremely fast reloading and a lot of them. This ship is fundamentally designed as a brawler, and of course for that reason this is the very last ship you want to be brawling as another battleship, because when he gets full broadside on you, you get citadeled, he eats pens, and that's not a trade you want to be doing. Still though, it hasn't seen much success in the meta as of right now. We've seen some clans try to use it in competitive. The reason I tend to refer to competitive is that people who play competitive min-max. For those that don't know what min-maxing means, it means they try to squeeze out the absolute best possible performance in every single situation. That's why keeping an eye on the competitive gameplay, even if you're not interested in competitive, is pretty informing, because if you see something is very popular in competitive, then it's probably going to be quite strong in random as well, because these players choose it for a reason. Grosse Kurfürst though has really struggled with competitive. Lack of maneuverability, lack of concealment, and especially with the Hindenburg HE pen and Hindenburg being very popular in competitive means that this 50mm armor renders it quite vulnerable, or the large size renders it quite vulnerable to being burned down by Hindenburgs. And of course, torps are always going to be a thing. AA isn't particularly strong either. Now, it's not the end of the world type of AA, but well, honestly, it is pretty bad. If a carrier wants to kill you, there is not really much you can do. Now, that's shared across all tier 10 battleships, but the Kurfürst is absolutely at the lower end of AA. Another thing to keep in mind is the somewhat recent addition of AP bombs, and the Kurfürst, because of this turtleback. Another downside of this turtleback is that there is plenty of armor here to arm those incoming AP dive bombers. So what happens is, especially once again, the combination of this large size and this turtleback means that AP dive bombers tend to score very heavy hits on German BBs. Bismarcks, Tirpitzes, Friedrich Grosse and Grosse Kurfürst are all especially vulnerable to this. And one last thing that I should mention, that once again goes back to the early comparison, is of course the secondaries on the ship. The secondaries on the Grosse Kurfürst are very strong, and especially, well, it is a brawling battleship once again, and this supports it extremely well. It's also worth keeping in mind that I did mention that German BBs have improved HE penetration, and this is also shared with the secondaries. Now, it's not all secondaries. The 105mm secondaries, as far as I understood, do not get this penetration bonus, but the 128mm do. So the German battleships pretty much have built-in IFHE secondaries, which is also, of course, going to be an advantage in these close-range brawls. Still though, is it the best tier 10 battleship? Not the easiest choice to make, is it? As our fourth battleship, we have the Royal Navy Tier 10 Conqueror. A terrifying battleship that is often considered probably the single most frustrating battleship in the entire game to fight. Now this battleship also comes in two different gun types, just like the Grosse Kurfürst, but pretty much no one uses the 457mm guns, so I'm gonna skim over them. People don't use it because it lacks both DPM and effectiveness, and it doesn't have the overmatch of the Yamato 460mm, so in general it doesn't see much popularity at all. What people use are these 419mm guns, and the preferred ammunition of type is HE, which is of course one of the reasons why it's exceptionally frustrating to deal with. This raw HE has, as I mentioned, British battleships get quarter pen, which means that instead of dividing by 6 you divide by 4, so these 490mm guns end up with something like 105mm of HE penetration, which means all that fancy armor that I've been highlighting, the 50mm deck armor and all that, well, it of course easily gets penetrated by the Conqueror. It has absolutely no issues, so it does massive raw HE damage, and it has an insanely high chance of setting fires per shell as well. So with this combination, it is the ultimate anti-battleship because, well, it doesn't matter if you angle, it doesn't matter how you try to angle or kite away or in any way avoid these shells. All you need to do with the Conqueror is hit the enemy battleship and you will be dealing devastating damage and probably starting fires. You probably noticed that I healed up from practically half HP to full HP, and you noticed that I probably gave full broadside to that Montana because the Henry wasn't quick enough to turn away, so I was kind of caught full broadside and I wasn't really punished. These all contribute to the factors that make the Conqueror such a massively frustrating battleship to fight against. For an enemy battleship, that is. It's especially rough for battleships. Not quite as bad for the rest, but battleships in particular tend to hate this thing. Like Montana here, he tries to go nose in, he tries to angle, he tries to mitigate the incoming damage, but his 32mm bow and stern and 38mm deck armor can't really deal with the raw HE penetration that comes out of this ship. So it's practically just a matter of time before he dies. And of course the heal is absurd. If you look at the bottom left, you can see just how much I am capable of healing. That's half my HP pool. In fact, you can heal almost 40k health per heal on this ship. And that is of course an absolutely absurd number because the rest of the competition barely struggles to reach 20k healing per heal, whereas the Conqueror heals not only almost 40k with the help of the flag, but the Conqueror also only does it in 20 seconds. The rest usually take about 28 seconds. So it's faster and significantly more effective. It does come with some downsides. For example, you only have 4 charges and the cooldown on the heal is a bit longer. This was something that was added later because, well, in its release state it didn't have the additional cooldown, which practically made the Conqueror unkillable. Now there is a 2-minute break between the heals where you can do significant amounts of damage, but still, the raw survivability is one of the issues. Another issue, of course, with the Conqueror is if you try to punish it when it gives broadside, you will struggle to do any significant damage. And the reasoning for this is, well, if we take a look at the armor view here, first of all, it's got 32mm armor on pretty much the full broadside. So unlike the Grosse Kurfürst that tends to arm all that AP coming its way, a full volley on a broadside Conqueror often ends up in nothing but overpens, unless you hit that strong armor belt that will arm the AP shells. And even then, you will probably only end up with penetrations, because the Citadel is practically hidden entirely underwater. It is below the waterline. So the odds of getting a Citadel, especially in close quarter brawls, is very, very low. In fact, the only time you will see any sort of citadels is when you get these long-range plunging shells, or when the Conqueror is actively turning, which raises one side of the ship out of the water. So once again, it's the single most frustrating battleship for other battleships to deal with. That doesn't mean that it doesn't come with some natural battleship enemies though. For one, I did mention that pretty much everything on the ship was 32mm. This of course means that Yamato overmatches every part of the ship. So even though this thing can burn the Yamato, in return the Yamato can pen every part of the Conqueror very, very easily. And of course other Conquerors they love shooting Conquerors as well because of that raw HE damage. What is more important is that this 32mm armor is of course a great weakness against cruisers. I mentioned that the most common pen you will see at tier 10 is 32 mil, so obviously you can assume that every single cruiser in the game will be dealing raw penetration damage to the ship whenever they shoot at it. This combination with having the lowest health pool across the board with 82.9k health means that even though you have this super heal to help you out, if you do miss position, if you do struggle to disengage, well, you are not particularly hard to burst down in that sense. Especially cruisers focus firing a Conqueror can deal with it surprisingly quickly because, well, once again, there is nothing to mitigate their raw damage. There is no armor to slow it down. However, there is something that makes it harder to burst down, and that is, of course, the concealment. I did mention that most of the other battleships tended to hover around about the same concealment, about 13.4 to 13.7 or so forth. Well, the Conqueror sits at 11.8, which is incredibly low. It is lower than many cruisers, in fact, and this of course also allows it to make use of something I haven't really mentioned much, and that is the AP. The reasoning is because most players who play the Conqueror didn't really utilize the AP, but surprisingly the AP actually has very good penetration. In fact, at 12 kilometers of range, which is, considering your concealment is 11.8, you tend to sneak up on cruisers and then you open up fire around 12 kilometers. Your AP penetration at 12 kilometers is 627 millimeters. And that's actually better than both Grosse Kurfürst, and that's better AP pen than the Montana. So these close range surprise volleys with this 490mm AP are not fun for a cruiser to deal with. They are not fun at all, and it's a very nasty surprise to have a Conqueror pop up. Once again, this adds to this whole feeling of the ship being extremely frustrating to fight. The great concealment, the great heal, the unpunishable citadel, the HE to deal with any sort of nose-in tactics. It is the definition of a frustrating battleship to play against in every single sense. On the other hand, of course, it does suffer greatly from torpedoes. I did mention that the strength for its survivability relies on the heals. It doesn't have the raw health pool, it has the healing to help it survive. And of course, if you hit a torpedo to the center of the ship, it counts as citadel damage. And citadel damage can only be you can only heal 10% of citadel damage. Also, overpens and pens, you can only heal half of those, unless they overpen your citadel, but that doesn't really happen with the Conqueror. But in general, you can only heal half of overpen damage. I know there is a common belief in the community that you can heal 100% of the overpen damage. In fact, I've helped increase this belief because this was something that Wargaming publicly said, but as of late they have come out and admitted that whoopsie daisy, we screwed up a bit. You can actually only heal half of overpen damage, and you can only heal a third of citadel overpen damage. I think that's if it hits cruisers. Regardless though, pens and overpens, this will all of course reduce the health pool of this Conqueror, but fires that can be healed for 100%, well, the Conqueror is especially durable, especially sustainable against those. AA wise, mostly personal defense. The AA isn't technically that bad. It has quite a lot of mid-range AA. The problem is, of course, that it's very, very mid-range. It's on the low end of mid-range. So ultimately, and you really don't want to deal with carriers in this thing, because once again, you only have a 30% torpedo belt. And if you get dropped by torps, this will greatly reduce the health you can recover. It's a big downside, and carriers in general is not something you want to deal with in the Conqueror at all. Of course, carriers also tend to get you spotted, and since one of your great survivability tools is concealment, any sort of carrier games tend to have a significantly or surprisingly large impact on the survivability of the Conqueror. Now, how strong is it really? Against battleships, extremely strong. Against cruisers, it gets a bit iffy against cruisers and destroyers. The reasoning for this is, even though you can lob out these 12 shells, and if you run the reload mod, you can lob them out every 26.4 seconds, which is perfectly, very respectable DPM. The problem, that one of the reasoning why this has never seen that much use in competitive, well, it's starting to resurge a bit again, but the reasoning why the Conqueror hasn't seen that much use is the lack of dispersion and the shell velocity. In fact, if we look at the AP shell velocity, you might notice it's only 747, and even the HE velocity is quite slow, and in the fact that you have a 1.8 sigma on the ship, and you start realizing that, wow, that's actually not really impressive, is it? I mean, we got the Montana that has 1.9 sigma, and then we got the Yamato with 2.1 sigma. So having 1.8 sigma on this ship is obviously going to be a significant downside. I should probably also mention that they quite recently changed the turning circle on the ship. I assume it was listed the wrong way in port. It was listed as something like 950 meters or 940, and they corrected this to 820. So this actually gives the Conqueror the best turning circle. Does it mean the Conqueror is the best tier 10 battleship now? Once again, not the easiest question to answer. Last, but certainly not least, we have the Republic, formerly known as the France, the tier 10 French battleship. And this is one weird battleship in the sense of battleships. It only has access to 8 guns, but in return, these 8 guns have significantly faster reload, and they have insanely good pen. People often underestimate just how good the pen on these guns are. In fact, all the way up to 18 kilometers, this is the best battleship pen in the game. Only at 19 kilometers does Yamato's heavy shells bypass the Republic when it comes to pure penetration capacity. Another thing that is of course very important to keep in note is also that it has a 2.0 sigma, which means that it's quite consistent when it comes to dealing damage. And more importantly, the guns are 430 millimeters. Now, why is 430 millimeters such an important value? Because if we go back to the beginning, the overmatch mechanic, having 430 millimeter guns actually allows it to overmatch 30 millimeters of armor. And this is such a magically important number because, for example, the Des Moines that I'm shooting right here has 30 millimeter deck armor. The Zao has 30 millimeter deck armor and upper belt armor, and even the Henry has the same upper belt and deck armor, 30 millimeters. So being able to overmatch this is very important, especially because you have such excellent range and you have such excellent sigma, and the AP shell velocity is actually very impressive at 840 meters per second. So you can remain a threat in this ship even though you have so few guns. Across the map, these absolutely ridiculous volleys are perfectly possible. And this of course makes you a threat anywhere on the battlefield because of these guns. So the guns, even though you have few of them, and of course if you run all the reload mods and stuff, you can get it down to a 21.1 second reload. The sheer power of the guns is what has made the ship quite popular as of late. Massive pen, overmatch 30 mil, 2.0 sigma, very good strings. That doesn't mean it's all perfect though. Having only 8 guns can be frustrating. When DDs are spotted, if the sigma lets you down even a bit, especially on... Generally when you shoot DDs, you want to just saturate the water with shells and you get 1 or 2 good pens and you do significant amount of damage. With the Republic though, if that doesn't happen, well, it simply doesn't happen. If you don't get that perfect dispersion, then you're not really doing much. And for those times when the dispersion does let you down, having only 8 shells in the air, especially in close range situations, can be quite frustrating. Another thing people tend to notice on this ship is the speed boost. It's already, well, it shares the 30 knots of speed that all the other battleships have, but more importantly is that it has access to the speed boost to make it faster than any of its competition. Now, people often assume that this is a straight up advantage, but it's not quite that straightforward because you have to give up something quite valuable in order to get access to this speed boost, and that is the spotter plane that all the other ships have access to. And the reason why giving this up, well, not all of them, but the majority, and the reason why giving this up is such a big deal is because whenever you deal with these cruisers hiding behind islands, lobbing shells at you, or just barely about to pop out around islands, not having access to the spotter plane makes it very awkward to take these pot shots. Another issue is of course smoke firing. It's a very common tactic to shoot smoked up Minotaurs and Neptunes and ships like this, and especially now with the booster being added, you see them pushing into smokes and shooting from there quite often. And it's a very common tactic of using the spotter plane to zero in, get a better elevation to better be able to pinpoint where you're supposed to fire. And not having access to this is obviously a big weakness. Now this is going to change in the upcoming patch because Wargaming is adding this kind of silly circle on the minimap which tells you exactly where you're supposed to, exactly where you're aiming right now, which will make it significantly easier to pinpoint where to shoot smoked up ships. But even then, it's not going to be a perfect solution for not having a spotter plane. So the speed boost, while it allows you to reposition and escape and so forth and push faster, it does come with its downsides, because no spotter plane is always going to be a downside. Another thing to keep in mind is the survivability of the ship. Now, 92.4k health does sound quite impressive, and 39% torpedo belt, that's not bad either. These are very strong values, especially combined with the speed. The issue is that it shares the same armor that the Conqueror does, meaning 32 millimeters all over the ship. This of course means that Yamato and Musashi overmatch every single part of your ship. In fact, Yamato is a bit of a natural enemy for the Republic because, well, anytime he sees you, he just needs to point and click and he will deal heavy damage unless he of course hits your angled belt. But in general, especially because the Republic has such a massive nose to shoot that is made of only 32 millimeters of armor, it's pretty easy to just farm a lot of raw damage. That's something you have to get used to when you play the Republic, is that it eats a ton of damage. You don't want to get stuck into a nose-in situation because you will melt very quickly. And unlike the Conqueror, you don't have your concealment and you don't have your super heals to bail you out. The only thing you have is your speed and the hope that you can get out using it. Now, the Citadel is actually protected by a turtleback. It's not quite as foolproof as the Große Kurfürst turtleback. In fact, Republics do get Citadel every now and then. It's not as foolproof as the Große Kurfürst one, but it does give it some additional sustain, and in general, Citadels on the Republic aren't really that common. But you still kind of don't want to get into those close range brawls simply because it can be punished. And of course, in close range brawls, well, you are fast, sure, but you still only have 8 guns, and the turning circle is pretty atrocious at 980 meters per second. So not the most optimal brawling battleship in the game by any means. Especially not if you have something like, if you're trying to rush down someone who's just fleeing from you. The 8 guns, iffy, very iffy. Especially you got to keep in mind that 430 millimeters is not enough to overmatch any of the battleship armor you will face. So you will have to get the broadside in order to be effective. The AA on the ship is, however, very good. It has very strong AA values. It has pretty much no short range AA. All of its AA is long range. And if you build for AA, you can become a very strong anti-air battleship. The issue is though that most people don't build for it because, well, there's not really enough carriers in the game to justify putting so many points into building for it, especially since you want things like probably concealment, probably fire prevention because of this HE weakness. You're a very juicy target for HE spammers. So building into AA is not that common. And if you don't build into AA, well, we can show an example of my Republic, and I get dropped by a Shokaku. This is a tier 8 BB, tier 8 carrier, and he's dropping my non-AA spec Republic, just your average spec Republic, and you still end up eating the damage, especially in situations where you're playing aggressive, like in this situation where I cannot turn into the torpedo bombers because, well, if I do turn in, I get broadside to the entire enemy team. In these situations, especially when you have to rely on nothing but the AA, battleships are not very good at dealing with carriers, and even the Republic with all its massive AA, if you don't build for it, it's not going to be dealing with it very well either. I will add the caveat though that if you build fully AA Republic, it is very strong against carriers, but even then tier 9 and tier 10s will be able to strike you, even if you attempt for some full build. You need that defensive AA, you need something to help spread out the damage, otherwise it's not going to be as effective as one might hope. And I just noticed I've been saying the ship has 430mm guns, when in fact the guns are 431mm. Well, it doesn't actually have any impact on the gameplay, but for the sake of this I should mention it. Ultimately though, What is the best tier 10 battleship? Is it the Yamato with its amazing penetration and the scary, terrifying guns? Or is it perhaps the Montana with its incredible flexibility on the battlefield that allows it to pretty much deal with all possible threats? Or maybe the Kurfürst with its incredible brawling capacity? Or the Conqueror with its frustrating gameplay, tilting people off the face of the earth? Or is it actually this fast, spood-beasting Republic that can be pretty much anywhere on the battlefield faster than any of its competition? That is a question I don't really know the answer to, and that's why I presented this commentary just the same way I did with my best tier 10 DD and best tier 10 cruiser. I leave it up to you guys to decide which ship you think is the best tier 10 battleship. You might notice that I didn't go into super detail on every single ship. There might be some things, I know that I'm gonna have a comment, but Flamu, why didn't you mention this very specific thing about this battleship that is very important in my opinion? That's because already this commentary is 50 minutes long. If I went into every single detail about every single battleship, I would be making a 3-hour commentary, and I'm not even sure that would be enough. So this is a condensed version, mostly aimed at someone who's probably started grinding up these lines and trying to decide which battleship does he want to get. And the idea with this commentary is to help that player choose which ship fits him the best. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison and this commentary, and I will talk to you guys later. Oh, and also thank you very much all of you who took part in voting for the commander thing. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you very much for all the support, my dudes. Very much appreciated. Love you all, and I will talk to you guys later. My throat is absolutely exhausted after making this entire thing. Have a great one.